thank you to all the speakers. I would like to bring you up on the stage. And this is the time for, we are so much in time, I love this. I have a question, and then this is the time for the discussion and questions. You showed very nice, interesting cases and examples. That's with the seamless participation, that is interesting. For me, participation is when people are given in nature, more than human, are given agency. So to each of your examples, how do the participants get agency? What does the digital layer add or take? And how would we find ways to go about that? Weird? Different?
Crystal clear.
Crystal clear?
I would maybe say, if I can start a bit, I think it's a complex thing you try to bring, but if we chop a little bit, that's this idea of digital layer and social layer and this interaction. First of all, I think it's important to understand this field of being aware of being part of the participation and being not. And that's also a good question to all like people working with public spaces. How well is understood this kind of balance between visible and invisible, the data sensing and stuff like that. So I would start with this idea of understanding the visible and invisible parts of your digital layer. The second part is participation in a way that we want to facilitate these things. We want to really shape it in a way. But very often life is pretty chaotic, and people and their behaviors are also not easy to predict. And that's where, how can we leave the space of participation with some kind of preparation, but also with a lot of space for just let life happen? And that's, we already mentioned many times, Dunhill's one of the kind of message that let life happen, but let this environment being aware about what's happening. So in this case, I like this idea of seamlessness or silenceless, where it should be in some way, if we can let some things are not sensed or not created or not fully controlled, and let it just go in a little bit organic way. Because in the end of the day, human ecosystem as a data ecosystem are two like organic systems which will evolve and develop in its own way. And we will find what is interesting, we will find the way how to make them coexist. But sometimes over control and over creation can also make it too, like how say, not so free. So, and that's a big question, how to balance this curation versus let it go, and hope that it will work.
Thank you. Navid?
I would say the same thing, basically, that in the task of Malmö Generate District, I think the important thing is to create a frame or to create some different types of doors with different shapes that allow people to participate or to enter or to get a glimpse of what's going on in there. And then I think the first stage is this one, to let people in and then see what kind of help or analysis you have to give it. And I see these three presentations as looking into different, something is looking forward, something looks backward, something looks at this point right now. So I think it's important to also allow those kinds of doors to not just look to the future, but also look backwards and let people react to that rather than pushing just to shape the future. It's also important just to let people participate by just reacting and then letting it be, basically.
Yeah, I think some of the studies we've done with participation, it's less this passive interaction or participation, but more actively making a choice of, when we do these eye-level studies where people take pictures of their city, it's more actively choosing what to put on the table and actively taking pictures of what they feel like is important or informing their experience, rather than passively engaging with social media. I mean, maybe it's more natural and will be less biased in some way, but I think there's something interesting in letting the citizens bring to the table what they feel is important.
Can I actually bring a point, because I think we can have a little debate discussion here, because a lot of behavioral studies show that this active part is working very well in the beginning, but then there is a curve where people, if it's a little bit too active, they feel passiveness later. All this gamification and like active citizenship, it's work in a short term, but it's not often becoming a habit. And that's very interesting from theory of planned behavior. How can you create how much is enough activity level to make this comfortably becoming a part of a habit? This is becoming really interesting. And that's where I agree it's super difficult to find this balance between being active and being passive, and find the space where instead of nudging, which I'm not big fan of as a person who works with behavioral science, rather give the space for exploration, space which invites, rather pull than push. And in this case, this is almost the art to find this leverage point, not to overactivate activity of the citizens, but also not make them just scroll and not even understand what they read last 5 minutes. So I think this balance is needed.
Yeah, and also how do you facilitate the participation? Because I think often when we do participation at Gehl or like redesign a space, that you can't just be like, okay, so what do you want, and just
No, of course
open
not.
all doors. But like, so it's like we often talk like, oh, maybe there should be a bench, or we need a trash can or something like that. So how do you not just leave like a blank paper, but also sort of steer people, because not everyone knows everything about urban places and how do we design best for public, but how can we help people to have conversations and talk about the things that are relevant for urban design.
Some kind of trigger to start.
Yeah, so I think, but yeah, it's interesting the balance of how much participation as you mentioned.
Yes, please, questions.
Thank you. Very interesting discussion. I'm not from this industry. I'm coming from AI. So just data question. So are you trying to say in digital urban planning, enabling the interaction, the open interaction between different layers, as you mentioned, physical, is that the way to go? If yes, how will you make it possible for seamless participation? How will you measure that or include that?
I can give you one example. We're currently trying to like shape and work. A little bit spoke with you the idea of like accessing the culture, but different social groups. For example, let's just take a practical example. We have a city, let's say Malmö, where you have some social groups which not engage with the cultural events in the city, either rare or never. So, and then the question is how to attract this category of people to access this type of culture. This is more accessibility study. So, and that's where you start to create this first analysis. You don't go and just talk to these people in the beginning. You just first do a lot of context sensing where you understand, okay, where do they live? What are their patterns? What are their interests? You get a lot of data. Very often it's mobility data, how people really live their life, why they're, maybe it's never easy to access this place. Maybe something on the way. Question, okay, if there is this cultural places closer or more on the way to their work, would we increase the chance? And you start to kind of iterate these things first in more like simulations. That's what we do a lot with agent-based modeling in academia. So you start to do this context analysis, sensing the scenarios, let's say accessibility to the cultural places by a particular social group. And then you try until it works, and then you try to build the first pilot and try to do some urban study how that might work in the reality. But yes, idea before we, at least in academia, before we go to knocking at anyone's door, we do a lot of context sensing analysis to understand, can we actually predict this potential outcome, and if there is some positive kind of signals, we try to go and interact with the physical world. Because one example why I kind of also take the position of not engaging citizens too much, because it's always ranges. There is such thing as participation fatigue, when some type of groups of people are too often engaged, especially if we talk about segregated areas. They get these researchers and designers and everyone trying to research their phenomena sometimes way too often. In Amsterdam, there is a whole area in north part of northeast, I think, where people get it's enough of research of my customer group. Can you leave us alone? So sometimes we need to be very careful. And in this case, the seamless approach, seamless analysis, social demographical data, mobility data, synthetic population data, any type of log data, even energy data, you can easily understand the pattern when they use the electricity at home, can give you understanding, okay, they're coming, leaving home very early and they're coming back very late. So can give you a lot of context what their life is about.
Yeah, I think also this participation fatigue, I think I think it's valid and all that, but I think there's also an important part in showing that the participation has an impact or there's some results in actually sharing your experience, because if you just keep asking questions and you don't actually see a change or that your opinions matter or has any impact on your environment, I think that can also add to the participation fatigue. But trying to give back and elevate these voices, like some of the examples I shared with storytelling, or actually coming back with how it has informed urban strategy plan, or how it's have informed a design plan or anything like that, I think is also super important when we do active participation.
But do you always have to label participation as participation? Because that's something I struggle with in my mind. Like, isn't indirect participation just like life also quite valuable to make that happen? Like creating participation without the customer, so to speak, knowing that they're participating for a more of a natural response and not so afterthought response to things, especially in a local area.
I can actually give an example about that, because I'm sorry, I will be ambassador for unparticipation sometimes. Please don't get me wrong. It's very important to engage, participate. There are some groups that really need. But some examples show that sometimes, let's say, we work out with students analysis. And we notice that for some years now, students prefer not to live in a shared apartments rather than small, tiny, but my own. And this idea of sharing spaces is becoming very stressful for them, that they need to interact, they need to cook something in front of someone else. And we see the anti-trend of participation and socialization within this user group. What also brings is, as a feedback, okay, we a little bit over-push this idea of push them to socialize while we didn't listen enough, that they maybe want to have a little bit more leave me alone type of environments. So I think this participation should work very well with what's called in Sweden omtanke, careful listening before you do any action. So in this case, I like this more like longitudinal study where we can have enough observation, different seasons, different contexts. 1 year we had this type of crisis, this year is another crisis. Of course, it's slowed down the whole process, but it might give much deeper understanding of how particular neighborhood, for example, what are the patterns, what are the repetitions. So in this case, I think we need much more time and patience to notice these patterns rather than signals only. But yeah, I really agree with this point of participation could be many different things. We need to make this probably a word tree of what is participation and what is not.
Yes.
Thank you. This is a question about Malmö Generative District. So in my understanding, the customers that you would like or like you would expect to be participants or participate are mainly the companies, right? So this is more about organizations participating. Because the district is full of organizations. Am I correct? Or am I wrong? So I can then build on the
No, that's not. I think innovation comes from. I think the main hope is that innovation in Malmö comes from everywhere, regardless if you're an organization or if you are an individual whose creative mind is active at 10 p.m. in your bed, face down, whatever. Like.
Now to the question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Because participation is about trust. So you need to build trust first in order to enable participation. And you mentioned that a lot of the customers are also part of incubators, there are startups. And I was thinking, okay, so in Mink or in different incubators and so on around the area, those startups, they don't really stay in these buildings for a lot of the time. And with you need time to build trust. And then I was wondering, what is the rotation of these customers? For how long these people, whether they represent organizations or they live around the area, for how long do they stay in the area to enable trust building and then to enable participation?
Well, okay, so now we're moving a little bit from my part of the assignment, but for me personally, I think that enough trust is one person. So for me to gain trust in something, I just need one door or one mind to be connected to. And I think there's a great example of that up in Stockholm with the work that Blink Capital is doing, where Douka Abukar is the person that customer groups trust, and then she becomes the tunnel to something wider. So whether people are moving around or moving out, or moving in, or things are changing, that's fine, as long as your point of trust stays somewhere. And let's say that it ties back to this human layer, basically, that your point of trust needs to be a voice somewhere in this district, a person, until you trust it enough to become something else, for example, the digital layer. Is that an okay answer for you? Too abstract? I think it's quite concrete, at least. Yeah, okay.
Yes.
Thank you for all the presentation. It's been great. And I'm also from Gehl, and I think Clara has also put some words on this. But I think it's interesting when we talk about digital layers and the focus we have on participation, instead of maybe talking about how digital layers can help us also show impact, which would lead to more participation, hopefully. Because I think there's something in time that I think there's a reason why participation is really interesting in the start. And then you kind of lack, what does it matter? Like, what difference do I do? And I think there's enormous potential in using technology to actually ensure that we communicate back what impact it has. And I think for us, it's been really interesting to work in new geographies where participation is actually not a part of their culture or language even. And I think Clara showed one of these cases. And it has actually enabled us to think very much about how digital platforms and how we can actually create this storytelling can lead to understanding what matters. And I think the impact question is so important in that. Instead of talking about, is it participation or not, it's like, what leads to participation and wanting us to participate? And I think it's a question maybe to ask all of ourselves, what would make me participate? So I think just changing maybe the question or changing the focus in it would be very interesting when talking about digital layers. So this is more like a comment, but it's also like just a reflection that I think digital layers could really be interesting in this.
If I can just build on, I really think it's very interesting thinking, because Malakhatka described it very well in this Massaging the Message book, where our media get much more interactive. Before we just read a physical newspaper, but today we can like or dislike or comment and get the debate. We get this kind of engagement mechanisms almost everywhere today, especially in the media. And I think this also built from this idea of, okay, what type of impact to what type of values are important for me, because impact is a pretty big word, but do you want to have more care, more support, or opposite, more like just observe silently? So it's create this kind of diversity of different values and different types of impacts, which could go through the interaction with the platforms and digital layer. And I think they become some sort of medium where we can get the feedback. And I think this topic of feedback loops and constantly get the feedback from the city, from the neighborhood, from my point of interest, like game community in my city, and so on and so on. It's bring you back to yourself, and let's not forget we're human creatures. We're very curious about ourselves, who we are, how we live, how we feel, how I can feel better, because everyone is searching for some sort of your own fulfillment of your own needs. And I think digital layer has this responsiveness. The question is, responsiveness with responsibility this is really not an easy journey. However, this potential of getting feedback, I agree, it's enormous potential there.
Can we have a last question? Yes.
It's more of a thought that I have around it. So I come from tech, and I have a strong interest in design at the moment, because I understand how everything that we design has a huge impact on the human well-being. And when we discussed about having active or passive participation, I was actually thinking about, like in our brains, we have the conscious mind and the unconscious one, the subconscious and the unconscious, and we have basically, it's mainly split into different parts. The active one, I guess it's very connected to the conscious one, where you can actively just come and say, hey, like, this is what I think, this is what I want. And then the passive one can be sort of related to all the information that we have in our brains that is based on the way we behave and everything that goes in action through our feelings. And I think both of them are very relevant. I don't think we should exclude the active participation. And when we think about the development of tech, at the moment, I think there's a lot of, there's a small part of the society that actually builds the tech. And I can, whenever I talk to people that have nothing, they don't have any contribution to technology, I can see that they have very different opinions, very different experiences, and I think it's very important to open it up, in the best way. But there's a multitude of perceptions that need to be considered.
Maybe to a bit add on that, talking about perception, I think it's you're a bit touching the topic of neuroscience here, because yes, this is very correct that we perceive things differently, we perceive different interactions differently, and active and passive things, different cortex parts responsible for different type of engagement. Either you're observing and reflecting, or you're taking the action. So in this case, I think in general, I personally believe that neuroscience should be a type of science which we all should learn a little bit more, despite what is your profession and occupation, because in the end of the day, our brain defines a lot of resistances or invitations. And an easy example is if we go to phenomenology of perception, Merleau-Ponty, from naturally constructed world and socially constructed world, we very differently perceive, let's say, nature or built environment, like our brain differently, like reflect on that, even simple geometrical aspect of it, fractal geometry versus Euclid geometry. So, and I think brain can give us a lot of answers if we really start asking this question. So I really like your point that, yes, it's very diverse. It's very connected to your previous experiences, your memories, your deep unconscious part. And I also truly believe in the system 1, system 2 working in different occasions. We survive because we use both. But question how we can use more system 2 and be more not what you said, this what are we doing, but why, how, and all this deeper thinking. So
Thank you. System 1, system 2 from Daniel Kahneman.
Maybe there is system 3 as well. We need to.
Okay, this will keep forever. Let's have a question from people online.
Yes.
Last.
Yes. There's a question from R_EE_TA.
Wow.
And the question is actually to all of you, but I'm going to ask it to Clara because we're running out of time. So here's a question for you, Clara, and that is in what ways does your work impact how you yourself experience public space?
This is a good question, especially because I don't come from an urban planning context. So for me, I think, the question was again, how does
your work affect your own sort of experience of public space?
I think it's so interesting to get to experience the city through other people's eyes and understand how one thing that I maybe perceive as a nice place or somewhere I would like to spend time is maybe not a nice place for someone else, or there's certain features that are problematic for that person because they have certain either mental or physical disabilities or have a bad experience or association with that place. So I think becoming more in tune with other people and learning from other people's stories is super interesting, and is changing how I look at the city. And it's so interesting to also to just get to work in different cultures, as we did in Medina, and just understanding how there are so many things that we don't think about in my, or like ways of looking at the city, and that I don't think about in my daily life in Copenhagen. But yeah, I think just getting different perspectives is super interesting, and make you more sensible in the city, I guess, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all of our speakers today. Thank you all for coming and participating. Last thing is that we do have some seats at the core group for the Futures of Digital Urban Layers. So if you're interested, there will be 4 days, 4 full days of workshops in May. So if you want to read more or if you want to participate, reach out. Again, thank you very much. Thank you all for being here. Please continue discussions outside if you want. What I take from today, participation is a word that has been heavily used. And I'm not sure, to me personally, participation is not about socializing more or taking all the decisions, or I don't know. Participation is about being heard and feeling the agency of being able to shape as much as possible one's life in the societies, the modern societies, the heavily informed societies and heavily complex societies that we live in. Thank you. That was my last word. Okay. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Have a lovely day. Please come back if you want. And thank you for being here. Thank you for being here. Big applause for today. And yes, coffee, water, tea, and more participation outside or here.